The march that walked into a massacre. Albany, November 1965, the grass was taller than a man. That was the first thing Jack Smith noticed when the column stopped moving. Elephant grass, 7 feet high, dense as a wall, so thick that the soldier 3 feet ahead of him had already disappeared into it. It was the afternoon of November 17, 1965, and Specialist 4th Class Jack Smith, 20 years old, was somewhere in the middle of a 550-man column snaking through the Drang Valley of the central highlands of South Vietnam. The column had been walking for hours. Nobody had told the men at the center why they had stopped. Then the shooting started, and it started everywhere at once. To understand what happened at Albany, you have to understand what had already happened 48 hours before it. The Drang Valley in November 1965 was the site of the first major battle between regular U.S. Army units and North Vietnamese Army regulars. Landing Zone X-Ray, a small clearing hacked into the scrub, was where Lieutenant Col. Hal Moore's 1st Battalion had fought a 3-day battle against the 66th NVA Regiment between November 14 and 16. Moore's men held. The NVA lost an estimated 634 killed. The Americans lost 79. By any measure, X-Ray was a tactical American victory, and it was being reported as such all the way back to Saigon and Washington. But the NVA had not gone anywhere. They were still in the valley, regrouping, moving, looking for a second engagement on ground of their own choosing. Senior Colonel Nguyen Huu An, commanding the NVA forces in the Drang, understood one thing that the American command had not yet fully absorbed. The Americans moved in columns, and columns had flanks, and flanks could be rolled up. He would not fight the next battle in a clearing. He would fight it in the grass. On the morning of November 17, Lieutenant Col. Robert McDade's 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, roughly 450 men, was ordered to march from their night position at LZ Columbus to a new landing zone being cut out of the scrub about 2.5 miles away, designated LZ Albany. McDade would lead his battalion column northwest through the Drang on foot. They would link up with a company from a different unit and consolidate at Albany before extraction. Robert McDade was 42 years old and had commanded 2nd Battalion for only a few weeks. He was not an inexperienced officer. He had served in World War II and Korea, but he had not yet led this unit in a serious engagement, and his relationship with his company commanders was still forming. What mattered on November 17 was this. His column would be moving through terrain that intelligence had not cleared, in a valley where the NVA had just fought a major battle and was known to still be operating. The column set off at roughly 9 in the morning. Nguyen Huu An was 39 years old, a career officer of the People's Army of Vietnam who had studied at military academies in both Vietnam and China. He had been in the field in the Drang for months before any American unit arrived. He knew the ground. He knew where the grass was thickest, where the anthills were large enough to use as fighting positions, where a column of men moving in single file would be most exposed. When his scouts reported that an American column was moving toward Albany, he moved 2 NVA battalions, approximately 100 men, into concealed positions on both sides of the route of march. He then waited. Jack Smith was a specialist in Charlie Company, 7th Cavalry, the son of Howard K. Smith, the ABC News correspondent, though that fact was not something he led with in the field. He was 20 years old and had been in Vietnam for several months. He carried an M16 and a radio. On the morning of November 17, he moved with the rest of his company in the long, strung-out column heading northwest. By midday, the column had stopped and started a dozen times. The heat was brutal. The men were carrying full packs and had been moving for hours. Nobody at the center of the column, where Smith was, had a clear picture of what was happening at the front. There was a reason the column had stopped. McDade's lead scouts, near the front of the column, had grabbed 2 NVA soldiers, possibly stragglers, possibly deliberately left as bait, and McDade had halted the march while he and his company commanders moved forward to interrogate them. This was the decision that would matter. The column, strung out for roughly 550 meters through the grass and scrub, stopped moving and stood still. For roughly 15 minutes, the men in the middle and rear of the column stood or sat, spread out, not consolidated, not in defensive positions, waiting. Nguyen Huu An saw the column stop. He gave the order to attack. What happened next unfolded in seconds and in several places simultaneously. The first shots came from the front, the NVA opening fire on McDade and the lead elements near the tree line at Albany. Then, almost instantly, fire opened from both sides of the column along its entire length. Not from one point, from everywhere. The NVA soldiers who had been lying motionless in the grass and behind anthills 30, 40, 50 feet from the Americans stood up and opened fire at point-blank range. There was no time to establish a perimeter. There was barely time to understand what was happening. Jack Smith went down into the grass. Rounds were coming from his left, from his right, from somewhere ahead of him. The man next to him was hit. Smith fired his M16 in the direction of movement in the grass. He could not see more than a few feet. He could hear men screaming, and the sound of the fire was so loud and so continuous that it was impossible to locate any single source. He reloaded. He kept firing. He would later describe looking up and seeing NVA soldiers walking through the column. Not charging, walking, shooting Americans at near point-blank range. In the chaos at the front of the column, McDade was trying to reach his company commanders by radio. The problem was that his company commanders were scattered across 550 meters of grass and scrub, each of them fighting their own isolated engagement with no clear picture of what was happening elsewhere. Alpha Company at the front managed to form a rough perimeter near the Albany clearing and hold. Charlie Company in the middle was being torn apart. Delta Company toward the rear was engaged from multiple sides. What made Albany different from X-Ray, what made it catastrophic, was the terrain. At LZ X-Ray, Moore's men had fought in the open at a known landing zone where they could consolidate, call in air and artillery, and maintain unit cohesion. At Albany, there was no open ground. The grass swallowed everything. Platoons lost contact with each other within minutes. Squad leaders lost track of their own men. Some soldiers spent the entire battle uncertain whether the men around them were American or NVA. Friendly fire became a real and documented danger. Here is what decided the scale of the killing in the first hour. The U.S. Air Force and Army artillery were available. Gunships were overhead within minutes of the first shots. But calling in fire support when you do not know where your own men are, when the enemy and your own soldiers are interleaved in grass that makes visual identification impossible from the air, is a calculation measured in lives on both sides of the radio call. For a significant portion of the first hour, fire support was constrained by exactly that problem. The men in the killing zone were fighting with rifles, M60 machine guns, and grenades at ranges measured in feet. Jack Smith was hit. He kept fighting. He would later say he was not aware of being wounded at the moment it happened. He moved through the grass by sound, trying to stay near friendly voices, losing track of how long the fight had been going on. At some point, he found a cluster of men from his company, and they formed a small perimeter in the grass and held it. Around them, men were dying in ones and twos, separated, cut off, unable to reach each other. By late afternoon, gunships and artillery were fully engaged. The NVA assault, which had been designed to overwhelm the column in the first hour, began to lose momentum against the American firepower now directed into the grass. Nguyen Huu An, recognizing the window was closing, began pulling his units back before dark. The Americans called in airstrikes on the withdrawal routes. By nightfall, the main contact had broken off, though sporadic fire continued through the night. The survivors of 2nd Battalion spent the night in the grass and scrub around LZ Albany with their dead and wounded. Medevac helicopters could not land in the grass. Casualties had to be carried to the cleared ground at Albany, where extraction had been the mission that morning. It took most of the night. The following morning, November 18, a relief force arrived at Albany. The count was 155 Americans killed in action. Another 124 were wounded. In terms of single-day American casualties, LZ Albany was the bloodiest engagement of the entire Drang campaign, bloodier than the 3-day battle at LZ X-Ray that the country had been reading about all week. The NVA, by American estimates, lost between 400 and 500 killed, figures that have since been disputed, as most battlefield body counts from the Vietnam War were. What is not disputed is the ratio. It was the worst loss rate the 7th Cavalry would suffer in Vietnam. Each of the 3 men at the center of this story ended at a different point on that ratio. Nguyen Huu An returned to North Vietnam and continued his military career. He rose to the rank of lieutenant general in the People's Army of Vietnam. In the post-war years, he participated in joint meetings with American veterans and historians trying to reconstruct the Ia Drang battles, including meetings with Hal Moore, the American commander at X-Ray. He confirmed in those sessions that the ambush at Albany was deliberate, that his forces had chosen the ground, and that the stopping of the column had given them the moment they needed. He died in 1995. Robert McDade was relieved of command of 2nd Battalion shortly after the Ia Drang campaign. The Army's internal after-action reviews were critical of the column's march discipline and of the gap between the lead elements and the rest of the battalion when the ambush hit. McDade was not court-martialed, and the Army did not publicly assign blame. He continued to serve, eventually retiring. His name is less remembered in the history of the Ia Drang than Moore's, a fact that is itself a kind of verdict, even without a formal one. Jack Smith was evacuated from LZ Albany with his wounds. He recovered. He went home. He was 20 years old when the battle happened. He went on to become a journalist and a television correspondent, following his father into the profession. Decades later, he wrote and spoke extensively about what he had seen in the grass at Albany, accounts that became some of the most detailed first-hand records of the battle available to historians. He described lying in the grass, believing he was going to die. He described the walkthrough by NVA soldiers. He described the sound. He died in 2004 at the age of 58. The battle at LZ Albany was not a secret. It was reported. but it was reported in the same news cycle as the American victory at LZ X-Ray, and for years it lived in X-Ray's shadow. The second battle, the one that followed, the one that didn't fit the story of American success in the Ia Drang that November. The men who died in the grass at Albany are on the same black wall in Washington as the men who died at X-Ray. They are listed by date, November 17, 1965. 155 names. The grass, as Jack Smith once put it, was taller than a man. If you found this story interesting, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like if you learned something new, and leave a comment telling me which overlooked battle from the Vietnam War you think deserves its own video. This video is a dramatic reconstruction of real historical events. All names, unit designations, dates, locations, and documented outcomes are drawn from the historical record, including first-hand accounts, after-action reports, and the work of historians, including Harold G. Moore and Joseph L. Galloway. Some dialogue, interior thought, and moment-to-moment sequencing has been artistically reconstructed for storytelling purposes, and should not be taken as a verbatim account.